Hello everybody, welcome to Chin Fat. In this episode I'm going to be going over basically all the settings that you need to know about almost any of today's cameras when you're working with kind of a professional level camera. As long as you know these settings, you'll pretty much be able to dig into the menu settings of any camera and do the complete setup manually. So first of all, when you turn on your camera, you'll want to make sure if you have any auto buttons on your camera, you'll want to make sure that those auto buttons are shut off and that you're on the full manual mode. Oftentimes this is indicated on a camera by something that you'll either see a button for doing all auto like on a lot of Sony cameras, or on a lot of DSLRs you'll see a switch on top of the camera that goes either usually to a film strip to represent going into movie mode or a manual mode. Just make sure the camera is in all manual exposure mode as opposed to anything auto. And that will give you complete manual control over your camera. So any camera that you have turned on, you're going to want to hit your display button. Either it's the display button or your info button will bring up many items on your screen. And here I'm going to toggle through my display on this. This is a Sony FS5 Mark II that I'm working with here. And as I hit the display button, it brings up different types of displays here, different amounts of display. And oftentimes you can go inside your menu and tell what display here. Usually when you're setting up your camera, the more display items you have on your screen, the better, because then you can go through everything and make sure that you have everything set up. So things you're going to look for on your camera here is, you'll see top right hand corner, I've got my time code there. My time code is set on record run. If you go inside your menu settings, and here I have an actual time code setting here on the Sony here, and as I select that and I go down inside, you can set your time code preset to display regular time code, and I'm going to have this on record run right now. So time code will start whenever I hit record. It really depends on what you're doing, what sort of setup you have. Sometimes that people will use free run and they'll set their time code if they're jamming cameras with sounds to make sure that if they're jamming their camera with other cameras, with multiple cameras or a sound recorder, they'll want to make sure that that's on free run if they're doing a timecode jam. So that's a little bit different, but for most camera settings, you can just have it on record run. So the timecode will only run when you hit record. And hit record here, and you see the timecode run. Also, you'll see a couple other things up here on this Sony camera specifically. I have two card slots. I've got my card in slot A. Down below this here, I've got 48 minutes left on card A, so that will show you your time. And keep in mind that with some DSLRs, you won't be able to have your time code set at a specific time code. Usually, some of Canon's DSLR cameras, like their 5D Mark III, or like their 5D or their 7D series, will have will start the time code at 0 every time you hit record. Now I move over to the left. Of course, that's just a battery display showing how much battery power you have left. And now we're going to start getting into the important stuff here. Down below, we've got your format. Your format is very important. Make sure that you're recording in your proper format. Here in the US, with film, we typically shoot 24 frames per second. You've got 4 different things here. Starting on the left, you've got what is called your codec. That is the type of video format that we're recording in right now. On this camera, recording in the XAVC, which is a compressed format. We're not shooting in RAW on this camera. Depends on what camera you're using. Most DSLR cameras will shoot in some sort of compressed format. As we move over, that you've got your resolution, 2160. That is basically UHD there. We're shooting in 3840 by 2160. And that is your resolution. Next one over here is 24p. That's how many frames per second we're shooting in. And then as we move all the way over to the right of this information, that is 100, meaning 100 megabits per second. That's the highest quality this camera shoots in internally. If you're using an external recorder, you can oftentimes get a higher data rate and higher quality. But if I go to my menu here, usually you'll go into your menu on any camera and you'll look for this setup. On this Sony camera here, I go to record out here and I go to record set, and it'll show right here my file format and my resolution with my megabits per second. So I'm going to choose this. You can choose different file formats. Since I'm doing QFHD, which is basically UHD, which is twice the resolution of 1920 by 1080, I can go down to record format and look at my resolution. We're shooting at 2160 here. 2160, which is basically UHD, and shooting 24 frames per second and 100 megabits per second. So that is all set. So make sure that you are recording in your proper format if you want to be shooting in 1920 by 1080, or if you want to be shooting in UHD, or in some instances if you're shooting in a true 4K or 2K or whatever you're shooting in. Just make sure that you're familiar with your formats and your resolutions that you're shooting in and your frame rates, and make sure that your frame rate is set properly. Moving down the screen here, the next one we'll take a look at is peaking. Peaking is what we call a focus assist. Most of the new cameras today will have peaking. And what peaking is, you can see kind of this little weird red glowing stuff over parts of the frame here. As I change my focus, you'll see the little red glowing change. And what peaking does is it shows you what is the heaviest concentration of what is in focus. It kind of demonstrates your depth of field and what is in focus. And right there I can see on the rafters, and then on the background you're going to get a really heavy peaking on things with heavy contrast there to see what is in focus. And most of the time you can go inside these cameras here and you can find your peaking settings. This is going to be under my display here. I'm going to select that and go under peaking, and you'll have some peaking options. Oftentimes you have the option of turning it on and off. And then you have a color that you can choose depending on the location you're in. See, white seems to work really well in this location here. So I'm going to choose white, and then you can put the level on high, medium, or low. So sometimes you'll have a level of peaking. And if you're shooting, sometimes people leave it on just a little bit of peaking. It just depends on your preference. And there we go. So now I can tell what is in sharp focus by my peaking there. And that is a focus aid. Also, oftentimes, what you'll have in some of these cameras is a focus magnification option. This one I've got it just right on my handle. And as you push that focus magnification button, it will zoom up really super close on your screen. It'll just do a digital zoom, and then when you run your focus, you can really tell what's in focus there. So that's two different types of focus aids there that can be used with different types of cameras. And that's two different types of focus aids that can be used with various cameras. But like I said, most cameras these days will have peaking. The Sony has both here. The Sony FS5 has both peaking and the focus magnification to aid in focusing. All right, moving on down here, we've got right here, this is Picture Profile 6. What you'll want to do is, with most of the cameras these days, you'll want to look up to see if you've got a picture profile option. A lot of these cameras will shoot in what's called a log format, which is a very flat format, which gives you a higher dynamic range and better color information. So if I go under my menu button here, I'm going to go under my camera settings. Some of these settings you just kind of have to look to the camera and look for these things, or you can Google them online and find out where the picture profile is. With this camera, it's specifically under the camera icon. And I scroll all the way to the bottom here. And there is my picture, there's my picture profile right there. So if I select my picture profile, you can go into any one of these picture profiles. They will already have presets on a lot of these here. You can look at you can look up online to see what your camera's default picture profiles, what they mean and how they're set up. These ones you can customize. You can go under settings and customize things like your gamma, your color mode, and you can set them for different types of what are called LUTs. So here we have Sony Log, which is going to give different types of Sony Log, which will give you a different type of flat level. You can see it looks very, very flat. You can record in a LUT with like a Rec 709 type of LUT or a Cine LUT, which gives you a little bit of contrast and a little bit of a boosted saturation depending on which one you're going to be choosing there. And like I said, you have to look these up on your charts. It is very popular these days to shoot in a log format, like I said, which gives you a higher dynamic range and it gives you a lot more information. It's a lot better to do color grading later on if you change your mind on what you want your image to look like. But if you're pretty positive how you want your image to look, you can bake in a LUT here, a look, by choosing one of these right here. You can mess with the color mode as well, set those for like a Rec 709 or something like that, which gives you a very kind of saturated and contrasty look already. So just make sure that you're set on the proper, if you research that, make sure you're set on the proper LUT that you want to work with. This one I already had set in a Cine mode for a Picture Profile 6 here, which bakes in a look, but it's not quite a really heavy look. It gives a little bit of option for color grading later on. But like I said, the best one to shoot in if you're going to be doing some significant color grading later on is choose a log format. This one's a Sony, so I'm doing the S log. If you're working with Panasonic, it's a V log. If you're working with Canon, it's a C log. They have different names for them, so you'll have to look those up and research them. But if I'm going to choose one and do a log format here. This one looks like it's already in a log format. Let's go to setting here. This is in Sony S Log 3, and color mode is Sony Gamma as well, 3200. So depending on the type of light that you're working under here, you can choose different color temperature. With this specifically, with the gamut, you can choose what color temperature you're shooting under. This one I'm indoor, so I'm going to be using 3200 right now. Hit return, and I'm going to choose Picture Profile 9. And one thing to note about log formats, if you're shooting in log formats, oftentimes you have to put your camera in a log format if you have what's called a dual native ISO camera. That means your camera will shoot as a good camera to shoot in low light. Your ISO will change. I'll describe ISO here in a second, but your ISO will change its native settings so you have a good clean image in low light. And right now you notice that my ISO went up from 800 down here to 2000 when I went to S-Log3. And that's the lowest that it'll go. That is a low lighting setting for this camera, so it's not a standard setting. Standard ISO is usually set at 800 and below. So we'll cover that in a minute here. So for right now, I'm going to put this back into regular picture profile here. So I have my standard ISO set up. And next we're going to be going over our 3 tiers of exposure, basically. I think they call it like the triangle of exposure or whatever. It's basically your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed. 3 ways of exposing your sensor in your camera. And the first one here we're going to cover is f-stop. Right now I have a manual lens on, so my manual lens does not show the f-stop. So you see an f-stop down here. If you have a digital lens, basically one that sends digital information to the camera, oftentimes this will show you your digital f-stop right there. Your f-stop is a number that is a mathematical equation of your focal length divided by your aperture. So the length, the distance of your lens away from your image sensor divided by in millimeters divided by the diameter of your aperture, the opening that lets light into your camera. So that number will change as you change aperture. So if you have a 50 millimeter lens and you have a 25 millimeter aperture, your f-stop is going to be 2.0. That's how many times you can fit your aperture within your focal length is what that comes down to. So that is your f-stop. So basically the lower your f-stop number, the more exposure you're going to have. The higher your f-stop number, the smaller the aperture, and therefore the less light you're going to be letting in. And right now, and if you have one of those digital lenses like I was talking about, you'll see that number right there, and you'll likely have an iris. You'll have an iris slider on your camera, and depending on the camera, usually like on this mirrorless camera here, you can roll this back wheel here, or you'll have a wheel up here or a finger wheel up here, and one of these will control usually shutter speed, and one of them will control iris. I think on this camera here specifically, your thumb back here controls if you have a digital lens, this thumb here will control your iris, and then the finger wheel up here will control your shutter speed. On this camera specifically here, my f-stop is right here. You can see these are called t-stops. They're true stops. They're very similar to f-stops. One's like the actual measurement of light that you're getting, and the other one is like a mathematical, and this is the actual amount of light that's coming in measured by t-stops here on this lens. So right now I can set my exposure, and as I set that, you can see that I'm getting less exposure, more exposure in my lens by changing that. And as the number gets smaller here, this is a 1.5 lens, which is considered a fairly fast lens. And then as I change it to a higher number, I'm getting less exposure. So that's one way of controlling your light. And if you get too much light in, obviously you're going to overexpose your image. And if you have too little light, you're going to underexpose your image. And you can use this graph over here to your right. This is called a histogram here to determine what your exposure level is at. There's other tools you can use as well. But right now we're just going to talk about the histogram for exposure. What you want to do is you want to get that mountain in kind of a mid-range area here. I'm going to turn up my ISO. We'll talk about what ISO here is in a minute. But you want to get your exposure so it creates a little mountain level like this. It's kind of in the middle. On the left-hand side of your screen, is where you've got underexposure, and the right-hand side of your screen you've got overexposure. So if you have a shot that looks like this, that is very underexposed. And if you bring that up and get right about there, this is a mid-range exposure there, and this is a good exposure for this shot here. You want kind of this mountain in the middle, and if your waveform starts hitting the right-hand side, you're going to be getting overexposure. So you kind of want to avoid overexposure and get this nice little mountain in the middle. It's kind of a suggested exposure for your shot. And one way of doing that, of course, is by using your iris. But your iris is also going to affect depth of field. The more open your iris goes, the less depth of field you have. Depth of field is defined as the area in front of your camera that is in focus. Right now you can see that this TV in front of me is out of focus, and then the set pieces here, the back wood frame is in focus. As I change my iris, that will change what is in focus. And here we've got some selective focus going now. I've got the image on the TV in fine focus, and the background is way out of focus. So your depth of field is the amount of your image that is in sharp focus. And right there, it looks like I've got probably about, I'm guessing, maybe like 8 to 10 feet that is in focus. So that is my depth of field. And once again, the more open your iris is, the less depth of field you have, and the more closed it is, the more you have a very wide depth of field. All right, your next tier of exposure is your ISO, and you're going to use these three here at the bottom, your f-stop, your ISO, and your shutter speed to get the right exposure. Oftentimes your f-stop in film is determined by what you want, how much depth of field you want, and then you change your ISO and then you change your ISO to accommodate that amount of exposure coming in, or you change the amount of light that's coming into your camera. These Sony cameras, field cameras, are a little bit different than the DSLR cameras and the mirrorless cameras. Oftentimes you will have an ISO button right on the DSLRs. In fact, this A7S II has an ISO right here on the side that you can push that button and it brings up the ISO settings. With this camera specifically here, with the FS5, my ISO is right here. It's called a gain switch here. You can go inside the menu and change, you got low, medium, and high. So I go from low, medium, and high. I have different levels of ISO here. And ISO is basically sensor sensitivity. That basically means how sensitive this sensor is to light. One main thing you should know about ISO is, like with a lot of the new cameras, if you're having a camera that is capable of shooting in low light, and if it has a dual native ISO, something like the GH5S or the A7S II, then it's going to change your minimum ISO range when you put it in the dual native mode. Right now, this is most film cameras are set at a native ISO of 800. Basically, 800 is an optimal exposure range, and that basically translates to you getting a nice clean image. The higher you boost your ISO past the native mark, the more likely it is going to be that you're going to get a lot of grain and noise in your image. But if it's a native, most cinema cameras are at native ISO 800, which means if you shoot at 800 or below, you're going to get a very, very clean image. And once again, as you start boosting that ISO, your image is going to start getting noisy and grainy. So right now I've got 3 settings on my low, medium, and high. I've got them programmed in. On the DSLR cameras or the mirrorless cameras, you basically have an ISO slider that you can change. But right now I've got 3 ISOs programmed in here. 500, which is, right now I don't have very much light in here, so that's a bit underexposed there. I'm just using the house lights in this room here. As I go to 800 here, keep in mind that what's happening with your ISO is every time you cut the number in half or double the number, you're doubling your exposure or halving your exposure. Literally half the amount of light, or it's half as sensitive or double sensitivity. Right here, as I go to 500, that's not quite cutting it in half. The sensitivity, it'd be 400 if I literally cut it in half. And as I boost it up to my high mode here, I get 1600. And this is a pretty good sensor. This really gets a good clean image around 1600. If I go much above that, if it's not an S-Log, I'm going to start getting a really grainy image. So most of the lighting that you want to do in film, you're going to be setting at ISO 800 or less, and that there's an exception to be made there if you're shooting in low light and you have your dual native ISO pumped in, and you have your dual native kicked on, which means you'll get a good clean image around maybe like 2000 and slightly above that, so which gives you a lot more exposure level. All right, so those are 2 tiers of exposure right there. Let's go through the third one. Third one is your shutter speed. Right here, you notice that there is a 48. That 48 basically means 1/48th of a second. That is your shutter speed. That is, I'm shooting 24 frames per second, and I'm exposing every frame for 1/48th of a second. This is very standard with film. Film typically shoots at half exposure time. So if I'm shooting 24 frames per second, it is exposing the frame for 1/48th of a second. That's half of that's 24 frames in that second, and 1/48th is half exposure time. If I was doing full exposure time, it'd be 1/24th of a second, but I'm doing 1/48th. The reason why this has become standard with film is because they used to have what's called a rolling shutter. Well, they still do have those in film cameras. And that rolling shutter would shut half the time while the film was being physically moved to the next frame to be exposed. And then the other half, the rolling shutter would move past that. That rolling shutter would then open up and expose the film for basically half the time that image was in there. So essentially 1/48th of a second at 24 frames per second, or what they would call 180-degree shutter angle, is half exposure time per frame. So that became very standard with film because it had to block off the film for half the time while it was moving the film back into the new frame. The film strip, as it was pulling the film strip down to expose the next frame. Now keep in mind that if you shoot a high shutter speed, if you're outside and there's a lot of light and you change your shutter speed to a higher shutter speed, keep in mind that you're going to be getting a choppier image. You're going to be eliminating motion blur. If you have a lower shutter speed at 1/48, you're going to get a very standard motion blur. So here I've got two videos. One is showing here at a higher shutter speed, and you can see the motion blur. If we freeze frame it too, the motion blur is pretty much gone. And then if you do a standard shutter speed, and you're getting kind of this motion blur, and that looks very, very normal to us as well. If you have a higher shutter speed, it's going to look weird and choppy, and if you have a standard shutter speed, you're going to get kind of this more natural motion blur. All right, now say you're shooting your movie and you have a certain f-stop that you want to shoot at because you want a certain depth of field. Say you want your f-stop at 4. Let's say you want your f-stop at like 4.0. You want your ISO at 800 or below. If you're outside, we might be able to turn this down to like 200 because the sunlight is so stinking bright. And you also have your shutter speed. Let's say you want that natural shutter speed at 1/48. What you're going to get outside is you're going to get a very overexposed image. So if you want those settings, you want that look, you're going to have to use something called neutral density. This camera has a built-in neutral density filter for outside, so I don't have to put this super high shutter speed that gives me this really choppy image. Right here on this camera, I've got this little ND filter right here. Right now it's on clear, which means it's got nothing on it. And as I change this here, click that over. As I change this here, you'll notice, look what's happening to my image. It's basically putting sunglasses in front of my image so I can maintain my shutter speed, maintain my ISO and my f-stop without overexposing the image if I'm outside, where it's really bright. But that's a quarter ND there. That's 1/16 ND. It's got the numbers up at the top, 1/64 if you're in super bright sunlight there. So your ND is basically like putting sunglasses in front of your camera. Now this Sony camera has a built-in ND, and a lot of cameras won't. If they don't have a built-in ND, you're going to have to use what I would recommend getting, and you have to get it for every different size of lens that you have. If you don't have a different ring size for each camera or for each lens, you'll have to look up the number on that camera and see what your ring size is. But this here is a variable ND. Let me get that in focus here. This is a variable ND filter that will screw right onto the front of your lens, and it has a very specific ring size. And this is a rotating one. It has two little rings here that rotate, and as you rotate this, look what happens to your ND here. It gets darker and lighter and lets through it, and you can adjust this until you get the right darkness. So this is basically like putting an adjustable sunglasses on your, camera here. So these are, you can get these fairly cheap, around like 30 to 40 bucks depending on the size of your lens. But one thing you'll want to look for is your ring size on your lens. This here is a 49 millimeter ring size, so this will fit a 49 millimeter ring size lens. And if you have a bigger lens or a smaller lens, it'll change in the ring size. And you can usually find the ring size. Just look up your lens type online. It'll show you what your ring type is, or it will actually show it on the side of the lens. Oftentimes, it will show a number on the side of your lens that will tell you what size of ring you have, and it's done by this little symbol here that you see. This little symbol mark on your camera will show you what your ring size is to put a filter on your lens. Finally, last little thing I'm going to show you here is your white balance on the camera here. Bottom right hand corner on this display screen, we see a sun. Right now this is set for sunlight. This thing, with this camera specifically, oftentimes you'll see it'll be called white balance, but you can go into your white balance settings in here and change your temperature setting for the proper light that you're working under. Right now I'm under fluorescent light, so this should be a 4,000 Kelvin temperature. Indoor incandescent light is 3,200. LED lights are oftentimes 5,600 or match daylight. Daylight outdoor level is usually, it will be 5,600. With this one, I can just go and do my basic settings. I can do a manual. I can do indoor right there. That's looking a little bit better with more accurate colors there. Or I can go outdoor, which is sunlight, and then you can go in and set your manual color temperature as well on this camera. So right now, usually with indoor and outdoor, you've got it covered. If you're shooting under fluorescence, you'll have to do, oftentimes you'll see this camera, you have to go in and do it manually, but most cameras will have a fluorescent symbol in there that will look kind of like this. There's your fluorescent symbol right here, but now this is incandescent, and that's a sunlight, so that's indoor and outdoor, and you can see the color temperature changing. So right there it thinks there's more outdoor light, it's more blue light, so it's adding a little bit more orange, warm temperature to it. So once you get these basic settings down, once again, just quick refresher. Right here we've got your format. Make sure you're shooting at the proper format, frame rate, and resolution. Make sure that your f-stop is set properly for exposure. Use your histogram for exposure to make sure that your image is properly exposed and not overexposed or underexposed. Your ISO, which is your sensor sensitivity, at 800 or less, and unless you're shooting in dual native mode. And then your shutter speed right here, 1/48 of a second, and also your white balance here. So making sure that those settings are all set, that you're looking at your screen, and of course then you got your focus aids as well. If you turn your peaking on and off, that will help you make sure that you got a shot that is in focus properly, and your shot is exposed properly as well, using those tools there to get a good manual exposure. And honestly, if you know those things there, you get on almost any camera, you can open up that camera, open up the menu settings, and get that thing set to shoot a good looking recording. So, okay, well, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. And this is Chin Fat out.